Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about future of science and technology. And I see a whole variety of questions here. Question here from Elsie. As things become more and more software-oriented, like software-defined X, what do you see as fundamental limits in that direction across computing and materials and so on? You know, it's a funny thing. I was thinking really years ago, I happened to visit Leibniz's archive in Hanover. And somewhere in a back room there was this machine made of brass that Leibniz had constructed, spent many years doing this, that was a mechanical calculator, was probably the first sort of four-function mechanical calculator, plus, times, minus, divide. And I was thinking, kind of, for Leibniz, he saw at most a handful of these kinds of computers in his day. In today's world, we've got sort of computers everywhere. There's billions of computers, more computers than there are humans on this planet. But somehow I was wondering at that moment, sort of what would be the limit of this process of computers. Right now, you know, for Leibniz, it's like, well, I saw just a very few computer-like things back in the 1600s or early 1700s. For now, it's like computers are all over the place. But what I sort of realized in that moment is that in the future, one might be surprised that things weren't just made of computers, that there were things that were just materials, not things that were always programmable like computers. Actually, go back 100 years, and materials that existed were sort of always materials that in some sense nature had produced. Yes, we had refined some metal to be from an ore to a particular metal and so on, but somehow the molecules that we had were typically molecules, the materials that we were dealing with were typically things which somehow existed in nature. They were pieces of wood, or they were pieces of rock, or whatever else. And then there were things like plastics, which were sort of custom created materials with their own sort of molecules that didn't already exist in nature. And so this notion of kind of synthetic materials came into existence. That's kind of 100 years old. Today, we have all sorts of synthetic materials, all sorts of materials that we have chemically constructed to have particular forms that are useful for one or another purpose. Those may be bulk materials that we make things out of. They may be individual molecules that we use for things like drugs and so on. But they're things where we constructed that molecule that didn't already exist in nature. Well, the question is there sort of another level of this, which is where these molecules are not just sort of things that have a particular form that's useful to us, but they're kind of algorithmic molecules. They're molecules where they change their form, or they change the way that they interact with other molecules in response to kind of our sort of software definitions of what should happen. Sort of the big idea that kind of launched the whole notion of software, as an idea from 100 years ago, is that it's possible to have a universal computer. It's possible to have something where there's a fixed hardware system, but where feeding it different kinds of inputs makes it do different kinds of things, whether it's running a word processor, or running Wolfram language, or running a video stream, or whatever else. All those things are operating on the same hardware, but just being given different inputs, which correspond to different instructions that the hardware will do. But the whole point is that those instructions, the thing that says, you know, move data from here to there, add these numbers and so on, those instructions are just, in effect, data. They're just bits being stored in the memory of the computer that happen to operate when they're run in the CPU. They make the CPU do particular kinds of things, but they are ultimately their data, just like the data that says, you know, what's the arrangement of pixels to make this video image and so on. So to what extent can one imagine that in the future, kind of materials will be algorithmic, molecules will be algorithmic? To what extent will it be the case that sort of even at the molecular level, that there'll be something where you specify what it does in some external way by giving some kind of input, and then right down at that molecular level, it's wiggling around and doing all these different things, and those things are sort of running a program at the molecular level. That will surely come. We have a great example where this already works, and that's biological life, where it's effectively operating as a molecular scale algorithmic system where things are happening, individual molecules and cells and so on are doing things that are kind of like, we can think of it as information processing, we can think about it as processing pieces of matter and so on to do different things. But there are things sort of happening that we can describe in a sense computationally right down to the molecular level. Exactly how to describe that? Not yet very clear. When we think about computing right now, we're usually imagining some task that we humans have thought to do in our minds, and then we're saying, okay, computer, I want you to do this task. That's sort of the typical way we start in doing computation. The big thing that I've spent a large part of my life thinking about is when we specify a rule, a program that we want to use for computation, in a sense, there is more that happens from that rule than we can foresee from the rule. You feed in the rule, and then you let the computer kind of do what it does, working out, running that rule over and over again. And what can emerge from running that rule can be vastly more elaborate, more complex, richer than you ever imagined, than you ever foresaw when you specified that rule. But in general, sort of our typical thinking about how we use computers is we say, this is what we want to achieve. Now let's make a program that achieves that. That model has been somewhat broken in modern times by things like things I've done a lot, kind of searching for programs in the computational universe of possible programs. That's one thing. Or sort of what happens in machine learning, where you're kind of searching for lumps of computational capability that you can fit together to achieve the tasks you want and to have kind of learnt the things you're trying to train the machine learning system to do. And then sort of the nature of those lumps of computation is what allows the machine learning system to generalize to things other than what you specifically specified to it. But in any case, the main thing that we are most used to is you sort of explain what the objective is, and then the system goes and does it. Now, when it comes to thinking about biology, for example, it's much less clear in detail how that works. You know, we talk about natural selection, we talk about the survival of the fittest. We say, oh, there's this particular attribute these creatures should have. They should have longer necks so they can reach the leaves higher on the tree or whatever else. That's a very coarse statement about what attribute the critter should have. But what gets worked out at the level of individual molecules and proteins and growth of things that are growth plates on bones or whatever else it is, that stuff is being worked out at a much more detailed level. And we have much less understanding of sort of how the, in a sense, overall instructions flow through to that level of mechanism underneath. But that's the level. Well, so we can imagine, let's have a material that is sort of programmable to do something. Let me give you an example, a very straightforward example. Electro-optics, where you will have something that looks like a window. It looks transparent. You apply a voltage across it, and it will get polarized, and it will, if you have another polarizer in the thing as well, it will then go dark. So that's a place where, in a sense, you have sort of a very simple example of programmable matter, where just applying that voltage causes the nature of the material to change. But now you could imagine something where you apply some voltage, you give it some input, and then in that window, instead of it just being, oh, it went darker, there's an immensely elaborate pattern, some cellular automaton that's running in the window, so to speak, maybe down even at the level of individual molecules in the material. You could imagine that happening. Exactly how you would think about programming that is not so clear. It's something where you have given a specification and you want lots of detail to happen at the level of molecules. In the case of life, life has managed to make use of those kinds of things. Life has somehow taken these sort of overall fitness objectives and deployed them, implemented them at the level of all the things that happen with individual molecules and individual cells and so on. What I think, you know, was working last year a bunch on biological evolution, I think the main, somewhat perhaps disappointing conclusion is that what's really happening is there are these sort of lumps of computation that can be executed. And what natural selection is doing is finding lumps that happen to more or less satisfy those fitness objectives. But the actual details of how the computation is done are kind of, in a sense, arbitrary, in a sense, incomprehensible. They're things where the computation just happens to come out that way. There's no kind of simple narrative explanation. And that's more the kind of thing that one can expect to have happen at the level of sort of molecular computation in something like a material. So in other words, one can imagine making a material that does some kind of computational thing, but that computational thing will typically be sort of an incomprehensible, irreducible lump of computation where we'll say, oh, by the way, we happen to be able to use that thing to achieve this large-scale objective that we have. So a different question is, if you could sort of program it down at the level of what every individual molecule does, what kind of programs would one run there? What would one want it to do? For example, in biology, there are things that we kind of want, like we have our immune system, our adaptive immune system that goes and surveils our body to find whether there are any sort of antigens that shouldn't be there that are there. And we're doing a bunch of matching, presumably against sort of sequences of amino acids and so on, to say this is a sequence that corresponds to something that is part of us. This is a sequence that's alien. We should do something about it. That's an example of kind of molecular scale computation where the objective is match or not, so to speak, where you've got this inventory of things that are self kind of matches, and you want to say, go in at a molecular level, basically, and, with your antibodies or T cell receptors or whatever, go and actually just do a match against some sequence of amino acids and then work out what to do based on that. And that it's sort of a molecular scale thing. But that's a thing where, in some sense, the description, match or not, is kind of the large scale description. So I don't know what types of computations one will want to do at sort of the molecular scale. It's an interesting question. I mean, one could imagine all sorts of funky things. For example, here's an example of something. One of the still rather poorly understood phenomena, even after all these years, is friction. What causes materials not to be able to, solid materials, not to be able to slide relative to each other? And presumably, it's in large part that there's sort of mountainscapes. If you look at a microscopic level at the surface of the material, it's kind of like this sort of mountainscape of detailed sort of things that poke up and so on. And if you have sort of very pure crystalline surfaces and you have them in a vacuum, so there are no extra molecules of air and things that are getting attached, then it tends to be the case that these two very pure surfaces, you put them together and they'll just meld together. They'll essentially weld themselves together immediately. But when there's either sort of molecules of air or other kinds of things, oxidation that happens, there's sort of that provides some kind of lubrication. And there's also, probably more significantly, these kind of mountainscapes that exist on the two surfaces. One of the mysteries from 400 years ago is the kind of the standard mechanical formula that the frictional force is proportional to the normal force. That is, the difficulty of sliding two objects, the amount of force you have to exert to slide two objects, is proportional to how hard you're pushing down on pushing the two objects together. That's not precisely true, but it's a pretty good approximation. And it's not obvious why that kind of relation would exist at all. Presumably, you're squashing those mountainscapes and increasing the area of contact between the surfaces. But that's never been completely clear how that works. But okay, I'm just kind of imagining what would a programmable piece of matter be like. Well, imagine that you had a piece of programmable matter where effectively the friction of the surface could be changed by programming. Imagine you could just put some voltage across this system, and suddenly the thing that was very high coefficient of friction would suddenly become very slidey. That would be an example I could imagine where, again, the overall description of what you want is pretty coarse. It's just like make the thing be very rough, or make the thing not slide well, or make the thing slide well. That's an easy thing to describe, but then the implementation of that happens at a molecular scale. Now, you could imagine, well, I mean, other kinds of things that sort of happen at a molecular scale. Some of our senses, like smell, for example, happens presumably at a molecular scale, where there are little receptors that do and don't match molecules of particular shapes. Probably it works a bit like the immune system, where there are a whole collection, I think for smell, people believe maybe a few hundred different kinds of receptors. Analogous to, in the case of color, we have just three kinds of receptors for red, green, and blue, and well, roughly red, green, and blue, and also our rod cells for black and white. But in the case of smell, we're kind of responding to maybe 400 different sort of attributes of molecules. And I think that's another place where one could sort of imagine some sort of molecular scale processing, some sort of molecular scale uh, um, thing where maybe one imagines that the sort of pre-processing, okay, you've got this molecule, it's some smell, and it's binding here and it's binding there, and maybe there's some pre-processing at a molecular scale in those receptors, so to speak, that gives one sort of the pre-processing of the rough conclusion from that kind of smell. But I think, at a slightly coarser level, one can ask the question, to what extent could one expect that things will be sort of pure software defined versus one will have to have different hardware? One of the things that was a trend for a long time is sort of nobody wanted to do a hardware startup company. Everybody just wanted to do software companies, and everything that was going to happen by running the software on computers. The last probably 5 years or so, there's been much more of an interest in kind of hardware companies. I will say that there are sort of situations in which one feels like one's getting generic hardware companies. For example, when 3D printing came in and was a big thing, it seemed like one had a situation where there's sort of a generic way of manufacturing things. It didn't quite play out quite as strongly as people might have hoped, but it certainly allowed one to make parts that were very much more diverse and elaborate than have been done with molding and things like this. I think this question of sort of to what extent will hardware become generic is an interesting one. I mean, in software, we have the idea of a universal computer. We have the idea that if you can program it on anything, you can program it on a universal computer. When it comes to physical actions, that's less clear. I think, for example, with robotics, I had long been imagining that sort of robotics would eventually become general purpose by essentially having robots made of little tiny elements that could reconfigure themselves into a lot of different forms. I think in recent years, I've come to think that the most likely way we're going to get practical general purpose robotics is through humanoid robotics, because basically we built the world for us humans to have things that we can deal with our hands and by walking around and so on. And if we make humanoid robots that have similar degrees of freedom in motion that we have, then they'll be able to operate in the world that we've built in an effective way. And they'll be able to sort of do things which are at least at the level of things we humans can do. And we humans seem to be able to do sort of most of the things we care about in the world as we've built out the world. I mean, clearly there are things that are more difficult for humans to do, but mostly we've got some way of doing them, even if it requires that, we put on a diving suit or something to go underwater or whatever. We've got some way to do it. We've built a tool that allows us to do the things that we have traditionally wanted to do. So I kind of think that some set of sort of hardware-ish things will become kind of software-ish because of humanoid robotics. Now, there's plenty of things that are more at things like a molecular scale, where it's much less clear how that works. What is the analog of sort of humanoid robotics at a molecular scale? It's probably things to do with life. Life does many kinds of things that we want, but we've become more ambitious, I would say. There was a time when, before modern technology, before the Industrial Revolution, when the things you wanted to have done, you either did with your own hands or with some other living system. You got your donkey to do something, or you got some plant to do something, or something like this. You used life as your tool for getting things done. But in more modern times, we've got much more elaborate technological tools. When we build a cell phone or something, we're doing that. That's a very complicated object built on top of a tower of technology, and it's sort of a different prong than just saying, oh, we'll just be leveraging the technology, the capabilities of life. I mean, people at one time would say, well, it's not clear what's going to win, sort of digital electronics or modifiable biology. I think the growing cell phone hasn't been a thing, so to speak. The idea that one could have a sort of biological style cell phone hasn't really been a thing. We've been able to make sort of things like digital electronics at a level of almost molecular scale that is kind of very competitive with the kinds of things that life does, but in a much more precise and much more a way where we can more readily sort of build a tower of capabilities. I mean, it is always surprising that life manages to sort of work as well as it does, given all the different sort of details of things that go wrong, of, genomes that don't quite produce the right proteins and proteins that sort of bounce off and don't bind quite correctly and so on. And yet life still manages to sort of get along reasonably well. But partly, I think that's because its fitness criteria are sort of, it's much mushier in what it's trying to achieve. A lot of the time when we have digital electronics, we have very precise objectives that we've defined, and it really wouldn't work if it was just sort of only roughly doing it this or that way. But I think this question of sort of what can you do at what's the universal molecular scale thing? Well, one thing about digital electronics is, by the very name electronics, that most of the story is transporting electrons around. We have a microprocessor, we've got a bunch of electrons, it's becoming smaller and smaller number of electrons per bit that we're having to transport. But fundamentally, electronics is about moving electrons around to produce electric charge, electric current, voltage, those kinds of things. One thing that life does that is different from that is it transports not just electrons, but also ions, atoms with electrons stripped off and so on. It transports atoms around. And, it's got, in a cell, for example, there are transmembrane proteins that are actively transporting, potassium, sodium, other kinds of things into and out of cells. And that's something where effectively you've got sort of wire-like things, alpha helices in proteins, things like that, where you're taking atom by atom, you're moving kind of potassium ions through a cell membrane. So in a sense, what's happening in life is you've got circuits, but they're circuits that don't just have electrons in them, they have ions and atoms and so on in them. So that's one mechanism, that one way in which there's sort of another level of sort of thing that one could do. Now with electrons, there's just one kind of electron. And so you've just got circuits that have wires that move those one kinds of electrons around. In the case of life, you've got all these different kinds of ions from all the different chemical elements and so on that you can potentially be transporting around. I mean, life as it is doesn't use all of them. I mean, it only uses 25, 30, something like that, different kinds of ions. It includes selenium and iron and cobalt and magnesium and a few slightly exotic ones, but otherwise we're just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. Those kinds of things are the ones in really high abundance in life. But the thing that life is doing that electronics doesn't have to deal with is it's got different kinds of atoms, and it can't convert one type of atom into another. So it's stuck with a certain number of carbon atoms, a certain number of nitrogen atoms, and so on, and it's moving those around. And we don't yet have kind of circuits. In a sense, one can imagine that sort of an objective of nanotechnology is to have kind of matter circuits in addition to electronic circuits whose wires can transport atoms around as well as transporting electrons around. But again, there are a bunch of different kinds of atoms that one has to use. Now, it's a notable feature of life that it kind of recruits random kinds of atoms, iron for hemoglobin, for transporting oxygen around our blood, things like this, or, magnesium for doing photosynthesis, things like this. All sorts of kinds of random, oh yeah, this atom happens to be useful for this purpose type thing. What level of universality might exist in, well, you could actually use a different atom and achieve the same objective? I'm not sure. In other words, could one have photosynthesis, for example, with something other than the particular construction with, I think it's magnesium atoms, that exists in chlorophyll? Could one achieve the objective of the overall objective of converting sunlight into energy, so to speak, by some other means? One might have plants with things very different from green leaves if one did that, but could one, with some sort of assemblage of material, do that? Now, what we have to remember is that life uses another kind of universality. We're made of proteins, which are made of about 20 amino acids. And everything that is us is basically different combinations of those amino acids made into proteins. And one could certainly imagine, so in a sense, whereas, let's say in digital electronics, we've got just this one kind of electron, we've got in life, we've got these 20 amino acids that we're putting together in all these different combinations to make the tens of thousands of proteins that then make the many more, we don't know how many, different sort of combinations of structures that exist in cells and things like this. So that's sort of a question. I mean, right now with life, we're using the universality of amino acids. They're not the only possible bases for a life-like thing, for sure. For sure, there are other possible kinds of sort of elementary units that one could put together to create sort of molecularly sophisticated things of the kinds that life is. We don't know. There are a few cases where we can make simple substitutions for amino acids, and some critters that live in like high sulfur environments, I think, use slightly different ones and so on. But we don't know dramatically different ways to have components that we can put together to make sort of modified versions of proteins that are kind of have the feature that they're made of chains of something, but it isn't amino acids, and make things like that. So there's a certain sense in which there's also universality in the construction of lifelike things from things like amino acids. And so, again, it's to this question of to what extent could you make a universal molecular platform that could do all sorts of things that you want to have happen at a molecular scale, but be programmable. There's also the question of how would you do programming? In other words, I mentioned the example of electro-optics where it's just one voltage you're putting across the thing. And in the case of a microprocessor, you've got that whole innards of the microprocessor. Usually it's pretty two-dimensional still. One day there'll probably be three-dimensional microprocessors that are really where there really are serious wires going up as well as in the plane. Although right now that would be, there's some number of layers that get put down, but it isn't kind of there's a lot more in the plane than out of the plane, so to speak, just because of the way these things are manufactured. But one can kind of imagine, so in a microprocessor, there's like, how do you program it? Well, you have to send data in. It's got a bunch of, you look at an actual microprocessor, an actual chip in a computer. It's this thing with a bunch of pins coming out of it. And in the end, what's happening is that electrons, they're pulses being put into those pins that are kind of going into the innards of the microprocessor. There's sort of just a linear number of pins, and there's an area amount of processing inside the microprocessor. And so, in that case, you're sort of getting the data in from the pins around the chip. How would you get the data in at the level of molecules? We don't really know yet. I mean, it's worth remembering that if you're going to get the data in to a bunch of computer memory, the computer memory is laid out, let's say, in 2 dimensions, but you have to sequentially, in time, be feeding in, okay, this is what to put in this place in computer memory, this is what to put in the next place in computer memory, and so on. And maybe that's the story of what would happen in the case of molecular scale circuitry, is you'd be using time, so to speak, as the other dimension, and saying, okay, I'm going to send in at a terahertz rate or something like this a bunch of data that says, okay, arrange this atom this way, this atom that way, and so on, as you set these things up. I mean, I think one of the things that one is interested to see is to what extent one could imagine sort of molecular scale manufacturing of things. Just like, with 3D printing, let's say, we can make different shapes of things out of plastic, metal, whatever we want. So one could imagine something where at the scale of molecules, one is making different things at that level. Now, we can do effectively 3D printing with atoms using atomic force microscopy, where we're effectively sort of picking up individual atoms and we can place them somewhere. But it takes a really long time to do that. If you're making something atom by atom, placing one atom at a time, that's a really slow thing to do. You can have an atomic force microscope with many tips, which maybe you can control independently, and it's kind of doing those things in parallel, but it's still very small scale. Take you an awfully long time to build something out of individual atoms by that kind of additive manufacturing technique that's like 3D printing. Well, the alternative, the other end of the spectrum of how you make things is chemistry, where what you have is a whole bunch of molecules floating around, let's say in a liquid. Liquid is the most common place to do chemistry because it's a place where you've got lots of molecules, a high density of molecules, but the molecules are sort of bumping into each other. And then what chemistry is pretty much doing is saying when these molecules happen to fit, then they will undergo a reaction and they will rearrange the atoms and the bonds in that molecule. And so chemistry is like the things are blobbing around in the liquid and the molecules are going in all kinds of different orientations. Occasionally the orientation will be right and the things will do their chemical reaction and rearrange their bonds. But that's kind of the plan B for how you make stuff out of atoms, is you do it in this way where you say, let's feed in these things in this chemical soup and hope that the molecules will rearrange themselves to get to the form we want. Very different from saying, I've got an atomic force microscope and I move atom by atom, what's going to happen? Question is, what are sort of larger scale, what's something in between those two? What's the thing where you can seriously imagine sort of making things with the numbers of atoms that you care about making, which might be 10 to the 20th atoms or something that you want to make something out of. You're going to spend an awfully long time going and placing every 10 to the 20th, every one of the 10 to the 20th atoms separately. The time trade-off is pretty bad there. In the case of chemical reactions, it's like, well, all these molecules are blobbing around and they're all having the chance to interact. So there might be 10 to the 23 molecules that are all sort of in parallel trying to do their reaction thing. So one wants something sort of intermediate between those two to be able to have a way to sort of to be able to type in somewhere, I want to make this molecule, and then out comes the molecule. We can't do that right now. Chemical synthesis is a complicated art. It's kind of a little bit like mathematical theorem proving, where the goal is, we've got this particular molecule we want to produce. We have these input molecules. We just have to find these ways to have them sort of fit together like puzzle pieces. We do this piece of the puzzle. We do that piece of the puzzle. We kind of arrange things so that, these molecules would bind in this direction, but we don't want that to happen because that's not right for the synthesis pathway that we're trying to follow. So we have to kind of protect one molecule by putting some cap over some piece of it with another molecule, and then we wait until this has happened, and then we have the cap fall off, and then we do this thing and that thing. Typical chemical syntheses these days, maybe 20 steps, maybe 30 steps of different kinds of things that are being done, different kinds of raw material that's being fed in, and so on. Those chemical synthesis processes, figuring them out, can be a sort of a theorem-proving type thing, where you say, well, we've got these things you can do. You can make an oxidation reaction here. You can make a this reaction there. There are these so-called name reactions, which I think there are a few hundred, maybe more, that are these kind of typical reactions that you can apply. And sort of chemical synthesis is a story of putting together those different reaction types in the right sequence to get the particular molecule we want out. It's hard to figure out those sequences, and when you're actually doing it, the yields, the actual numbers of molecules that come out in the right form may be quite low. And but if you could do something which was really something more like sort of true engineering manufacturing of molecules, then you wouldn't have that story. You would be able to potentially have much longer chains of synthesis, and potentially you'd be able to have something where there's kind of a much more direct way of saying what molecule you want. Now, in the case of chemistry, sort of if you think of chemistry as a programming problem, it is a very, very indirect, weird programming problem. You don't get to say, hey, just put this nitrogen here in this molecule. You have to say, oh, I've got this thing and it's a piece of ammonia and it's connecting and this and that and the other, and it will typically orient itself in this way. And it's very indirect. You've got you've got these kind of very thick oven gloves on, so to speak, that you're trying to and you're trying to sort of arrange do typing and so on with that, and that's pretty hard. You have to do it in a very indirect way. We don't have a direct way to sort of do sort of constructive chemistry, so to speak. And that's something one could imagine. I could expect that one could make a device that is a molecular scale device where you really just feed it programs and it goes and it has little heads and construction pieces, and it's like a little microscopic sort of robot that goes and puts atoms in the places you want them put. But we don't have that yet. Interestingly, once we have that, presumably it will be able to make itself as well as to just be programmed to make other things. So we just sort of have to have one of it, and then we go to town, kind of making more things like that. I think it's well, there are these scenarios where one sort of imagines a self-reproducing factory where sort of the bad case, which people talked about maybe 30 years ago or so now, the bad case is you first invent that kind of nanotechnology that can kind of make more of itself, and then the world is quickly turned to gray goo because everything gets turned into one of that piece of nanotechnology. It's kind of like life. One of its achievements is self-reproduction, being able to make copies of itself. But if you engineered something, maybe it would be so much more efficient that the whole surface of the planet would quickly turn into that kind of gray goo. I think that's an unlikely situation for all kinds of reasons, but that's sort of the direction one could go there. Well, I think those are a few comments about sort of the programmability of things and whether we can expect that in the future, sort of everything will be made of computers, that sort of everything will become programmable down to the molecular scale. And I think there's some definite steps in kind of the kind of getting to nanotechnology, so to speak, that one has to go through. And unfortunately, they haven't been being gone through very quickly. I mean, there was a bunch of enthusiasm back in the 1990s, for sort of molecular manufacturing and nanotechnology and so on. I think a lot of what people imagined at that time is that you would take constructions like cogs and levers and things like this, which we know work mechanically at a large scale, and just make them very small and make them out of molecules. I doubt that's the right approach. I think an approach that is something sort of intermediate between chemistry, where it's just things blobbing around randomly, and that kind of very mechanistic, cogs and gears type thing is likely the right one. I think a lot of things I've spent effort studying about how simple computational systems with simple rules can achieve universal computation. They can do elaborate things. That's more relevant because it's easier to imagine that you have elements that are made from little molecules and so on, that you figure out how to sort of compile the actions you want down to things that can be implemented with those molecules, rather than saying, let me build kind of a thing that looks like a steam engine or something out of individual molecules, out of the molecular scale, where I already know how it works. Rather, it's like take components that are sort of provided for us at a molecular scale, and then figure out how we can sort of compile the actions that we want down to that scale. Now, some of what we might do is not compile the actions, but just describe the goals, just like in biological evolution or in machine learning, where we're just saying, we want it to do this. Go find something that does that. And the thing we find may not be a very efficient way of doing that. That's different from sort of the traditional engineering-oriented programming, where we say we know every step of what we want to have happen. But by the way, I would say that one of the things that was thought about already in the 1950s was the idea of a universal constructor. Just like we have universal computers that can do any sort of informational processing we want, a universal constructor will be able to sort of make anything that we want. And that's kind of what I'm talking about at the level of sort of the molecular thing where you just sort of type in what you want. You type in the molecule you want, and it's produced for you. Now, of course, another issue is that typically you don't just want a single molecule. Sometimes you just want a little vial of molecules because you know how those are going to interact with some biological system or some such other thing. But more often, you want something which is a whole object that has been designed at the molecular scale. Most of what we have right now are things like, well, you can get a piece of aluminum or something where, yeah, it's got lots of aluminum atoms in it, but you know the whole thing is sort of crystals of aluminum and so on. It's making the solid, so to speak. And the thing that you describe is a lump of aluminum, so to speak. Now, and then you've got this, well, I want a specific molecule, the thing that has this particular chemical formula. But there's kind of a more complicated thing, which is I want these molecules, but I want them assembled into this thing that is a larger scale object. And obviously life has done that. Life has assembled things into organelles and cells and all kinds of things like this. But a thing we absolutely don't have is any kind of description language that tells us that it's sort of a description language that says, here's how you construct, here's how you represent this thing that is made of, has a piece of the endoplasmic reticulum and it has a this and a that and this kind of membrane and so on. We don't have a way of sort of saying that. Even when it comes to specifying things in 3D geometry, it's quite difficult. It's quite non-trivial. I mean, we're just adding a bunch of things in Wolfram language right now to sort of enhance the way you can specify 3D geometry. You could specify it by saying, I've got a function that describes the surface. I've got some mathematical function as a function of x and y that says how high the surface should be. You can do constructive solid geometry where you say, I'm going to make this out of a cone and a cylinder and a sphere, and they're arranged in this way, and I'm intersecting those shapes together or whatever else. Or you can do things like you can say, well, I want roughly something that follows these, that has these sort of anchor points defined this way, and I'm going to fill it in some smooth way, things like that. But we don't have a good way of saying, here's 10 million kind of molecules and just set them up to sort of be configured in this form so that they achieve a particular purpose. Let's say I wanted those molecules even to do something fairly simple, like some kind of chelation or filtering type thing, where I just want these molecules sort of arranged in clusters in some way. I don't have a great way to specify that. I mean, when it comes to specifying molecules, one typically does that by saying, well, one might say these are the coordinates of the atoms, or maybe one starts from something like a Smiles string, just kind of a more sort of textual, symbolic description of a molecule that just sort of says, here are the atoms and here are the bonds that connect them, and then you just sort of use the physics to figure out where the bonds go. But when it even comes to specifying sort of clusters of molecules, it's not really very easy to do. I mean, we've slowly been working towards that in Wolfram language, being able to specify clusters of molecules and so on and do things with that. But that's kind of state of the art or beyond the state of the art right now. So the notion of do I have my way of describing things that can really specify a configuration of molecules in an effective way, we don't really have that yet. I mean, we have, when it comes to specifying other kinds of things out of data, like an image, we have good ways to specify, these are pixel values, and we have compression techniques and so on. But we don't really have that for sort of three-dimensional geometrical molecular type things. And that's one of the many things that sort of we have to have. If we're going to make a universal constructor and we say, I want you to make a this, you have to be able to specify what the this is, so to speak. I don't think we really have that right now. The best we might be able to do is say, I want to make a this that is kind of achieves these overall goals. I'm going to run a program that does some kind of adaptive thing to find a this that satisfies those objectives. And then I'm going to store all the details of the this in some weird format, which is then going to be the thing that gets read by my universal constructor to actually make a this, so to speak. Anyway, a few thoughts about that. Let's see, maybe people have comments on that. Let me look at this and then we'll go on to some other things. Let's see. I see a question here. Will there be a successor to the silicon chip soon? There's a huge technology stack that's been built on top of silicon. And it also helps that silicon basically comes from sand. It's in very broad supply. So if you said, well, we've got this wonderful kind of technology, but it needs lutetium and erbium to run it, well, those are much smaller supply. I mean, they're typically called rare earths. They're not as rare as they might be. They're hard to refine. They're not, they still exist in quite large amounts in the Earth's crust. It's just getting them out is lots of technology. But in any case, there were various times where germanium looked like it was a thing that could be used to have the sort of same semiconductor type properties as silicon. Gallium arsenide is another one. There are other sort of detailed things that sort of work more or less the same way as silicon chips of transporting electrons around using semiconductors as a way to sort of set up switches and things. I would say that the most obvious sort of coming attractions are probably photonic kinds of computation techniques, optical computing. One already has lots of data being transported everywhere through optical fibers optically, but the question is how much processing can you do purely with light? And the challenge there has been to make an optical switch, to make something that's like a transistor. A transistor in electronics, the basic idea of a transistor is there's a source, well, in the case of a field effect transistor, which is what's used in most microprocessors, there's a source, a gate, a drain. You have something where there would be a current flowing from the source to the drain, but depending on how much voltage there is on the gate, the current either flows through or it doesn't. And that makes a switch, because then it says, well, if you change that voltage on the gate, you can switch whether there's something, perhaps quite a lot of current flowing the other way. So the question is, can one make a thing like that optically? And one doesn't know how to do that yet. One knows how to do that when there's very intense light. One can have kind of absorbers of light that respond to sort of other respond to things. But when it's small amounts of light, small numbers of photons and things, one doesn't know how to do that yet. If that gets invented, immediately there will be huge amount of technology for photonic computing. I mean, it kind of reminds one of the blue LED. I mean, for a long time, one would have LED displays, light-emitting diode displays. Those are cases where the semiconductors, where one is kind of having electrons sort of be moved around the semiconductor, and as you put electrons in the right place, they'll kind of change their state and emit a photon. And the way that was set up, they could emit red photons, they could emit green photons, but couldn't emit blue photons. Nobody knew how to make them emit blue photons. And then maybe, when was it? 35 years ago, 40 years ago, 30, I think 35 years ago-ish. Somebody invented a way to get blue photons emitted. And, that seems like kind of a detail, making a blue LED. It seems like the kind of obscure thing where somebody would do it just because, it's a thing out there to do. But no, as soon as you had a blue LED, it opened white light coming from LEDs. And that's where sort of all the LED lighting that we now have is made possible by combining red, green, and blue emission from LEDs. So I think it'll be the same thing with photonic switches. If it turns out there's a way found, and I think it's quite possible that there will be some material that can be used, or some constructed sort of metamaterial that can be used to make a photonic switch. As soon as that happens, there'll be lots of technology that's based on photons, and that has probably a bunch of advantages that have to do with lower power consumption, faster switching. I mean, photons go potentially faster it'll probably in things like fiber optics or in some material. It won't be in free space, probably. Photons in free space go at the speed of light, but photons in a piece of glass go 1.5 times slower than the speed of light, roughly. But that's still faster than electrons are typically going in wires. So that's another sort of advantage. But anyway, that's one thing that will surely happen. I mean, in a sense, the efforts in quantum computing, which I don't think as such that quantum computers will be a thing. I mean, quantum sensors and all sorts of other quantum effect related devices will surely be important. Quantum computing as such, I think, is not really going to be a thing for all kinds of reasons. But the technologies that are being developed for that as a way to sort of get down to the level of individual quantum bits are perhaps relevant, although many of them are pretty far away in terms of making a practical computer, whether it's cold atoms or ion traps or superconducting magnetic field devices and so on. These are all, I think, not sort of easy to make computers out of. I mean, one thing that's come out of even work I've done is the realization that you can kind of make computers out of basically anything. Lots of things you can think of as computing. If you have a fluid that has all those molecules sort of bouncing around and the fluid is flowing in complicated ways, maybe it's making turbulent flow and so on, that all those processes can be thought of as doing computations. The challenge is to figure out how to program such a thing, to figure out how do you take a computation you want to do and put it in a form where it can be executed by the motions of a fluid. And that we do not know how to do at this time. But so that's sort of a different end of the problem of how do you program things and what kinds of technologies can you use. Let's see. Looking at some. Christian comments, generating molecules on the fly is the holy grail. Imagine being able to create a protein that fixes a new food allergy you got within a few days of your first reaction. Yeah, well, I mean, there's something much before that. I mean, in algorithmic drugs or even custom-made drugs are sort of an earlier thing. I mean, certainly some modern cancer therapies like CAR T therapies and so on that are based on essentially making a custom version of a molecule, in that case, a T cell receptor, that has been sort of set up to be a molecule that has a particular form that is the one you need to attack this kind of cancer. I mean, it's worth remembering that the immune system is a place where sort of custom molecules are being made all the time. There are 10 billion different kinds of antibodies, maybe trillions of kinds of T cell receptors, and each of those is sort of made by having this variable region of different amino acids in a sequence there. And that, it seems like, well, you're just having a different sequence of amino acids. It's more than that, because the sequence of amino acids determines how the protein folds. And you can have very different physical structures. I mean, one of the fundamental problems of immunology is the sort of universality of antibodies. How does it come to be the case that you can make just out of these proteins that have a few different elements, maybe, I don't know, 9 to 12 different sort of replaceable elements? How can you, by just replacing those elements, make things that are somehow shape universal, that somehow correctly sort of match the shapes of antigens and don't match the shapes of other kinds of things, and so on? That's sort of a mystery, but that's a place where already what's happening is biology is constructing molecules with particular shapes. Now, its way of doing that is very non-engineering oriented. Its way of doing that is just, you got 10 billion different kinds and they're all made at random and they're all being made all the time. And the ones that happen to bind get amplified, and those are the ones you get. So it's not something like, well, let's design it. Let's make a computer-aided design system that makes this, and then let's churn out these molecules. It's more, let's just have a thing where we generate all the possibilities and we see which ones work. Now, when it comes to sort of these custom-made drugs and so on, that is much more of a story of you find what thing you want to get. You say, I'm going to make more of this. You put it in a bioreactor. You just, you replicate cells. You get more and more of this particular kind of molecule. And that's sort of a custom-made molecule that was chosen to have a particular sequence that is relevant for some particular kind of cancer therapy or some such other thing. I suppose the next stage of that is to do something where at the level of a molecule or maybe an artificial cell, real decisions are being made about what to do in sort of in real time. Actually, in biology, I don't know to what extent that's done. I mean, biology, it's like a cell just does what it does. And I mean, I guess it can switch itself on and off in certain ways, but I'm not sure how sophisticated it is algorithmically. I mean, I think it's like, okay, you've got an antibody, you've got a T cell. It's either going to bind or it's not. And it's not like it goes within the cell itself that it's making all kinds of algorithmic decisions. But I'm not sure. I think that one of the things one can kind of think about is the possibility of sort of an algorithmic drug that does computation at the level of at a molecular scale. Now, we know in the immune system, we know in some drug operations that that there can be like, oh, you have to have this binding and that not binding and this binding. It's kind of some Boolean operation that determines whether the molecule will do a particular thing. And there's a question of, and sometimes biology goes to very elaborate lengths to implement certain kinds of effectively Boolean operations. There's a question of to what extent you can do that directly at the level of just make a molecule that has burnt into it certain kinds of computations, maybe just Boolean tests or something perhaps more elaborate. Let's see. Seeing something about from 26 about talking about submolecular processes using interferometry. Yeah, I think this is responding to the question about optical switches. Yeah, I think, it's one of those kinds of things that one day, maybe somebody's just going to say, okay, I made it. And then they're going to be billions of them running, coming off production lines, and it'll be sort of a new world of optical computing, but that hasn't happened yet. Let's see, Canper is talking about, in terms of modeling molecules, how would we ever describe the first endosymbiont as a possible occurrence? So I think maybe you're referring to things like mitochondria that are, a surprising fraction of our body mass. I don't know, there's 10%, maybe more than that. It turns out to be mitochondria, which are these kind of sort of critters that presumably evolved separately in the history of life on Earth, but are now included in large numbers in basically every cell in our body and are the things that make energy for us, like chloroplasts make it for plants. The kind of the mechanics of how that worked and sort of how the different strands of origin of life developed, we don't know yet. But I think I don't know I mean, one of the things that's sort of a coming attraction of mitochondria is can you just sort of inject a bunch of mitochondria and have them just be ingested into cells to act in to do the right thing? I mean, there's increasing evidence now that when you have, I don't know, muscle cells that are really, or heart muscle cells or something like that, that are really having to, use a lot of energy, that the mitochondria just sort of migrate from other places and go fill those things up with mitochondria to provide more energy. And the mechanics of how that works is, well, first thing is to observe that it does work. And, it's the usual story in biology that you might have said, oh, mitochondria just exist in individual cells. Okay, well, then mitochondria can migrate. Well, maybe they migrate a bit. Maybe it matters how much they migrate. There's always footnotes to footnotes to footnotes. I mean, it's always very complicated. And there's usually never a clean statement. This happens, this doesn't happen. It's always, well, this more or less happens, but there's this special case where that happens, and so on. Let's see. Matthew asks, at what point does modifying biology stop being healing and start being rewriting nature? Yeah, good question. I mean, it's at what point do you go into the fertilized egg cell and start rewriting the DNA? And say, there'll be these waves of fashions for people having green eyes or something like this that come, well, because, everybody in that period of a few years, there was a big fashion and everybody rewrote the DNA of their children to have green eyes or something. You know, that path is fraught with difficulty, partly for the exact reason that I was just saying, that biology is sort of more complicated than you can possibly imagine. And when you think you can engineer biology, you're usually wrong. It's usually, well, you can do this one thing, but then something else changes and you didn't expect that. And it's a whole tower of different things. So maybe, you go in and you edit the genome to make everybody have green eyes, and suddenly you discover that if you have green eyes, you also are flat-footed or something. And that comes because some piece of DNA was some protein that got produced was in this and that and the other, and it's a set of combinations that are very hard to predict. I mean, it's this kind of whole story that I talk about a lot about computational irreducibility. Just because you know the rules by which something operates doesn't mean that you can work out what the consequences of those rules will be, other than by just running them, other than by just sort of, in this case, making the organism. But I think it's an interesting question. To what extent, and it's a sort of an ethical question and so on, to what extent things are sort of diseases and problems versus to what extent they're just different. And, many people who are, for example, have not neurotypical or something, or you'd say that's one way to say it. Another thing is the people who thought they were neurotypical are neuroatypical relative to the people who they thought were neuroatypical, so to speak. And it's like, well, I suppose the only ultimate thing is if you have a trait that kills you, then you probably don't want that trait. There's nothing to discuss really because you don't exist to discuss it. But if you have some, if you have some particular kind of behavioral characteristic, and you say, I like my behavioral characteristic. Somebody else might say it's a disease or something. But who's to say that that's if you like it, well, maybe it's okay. But then you could say, well, but you shouldn't like it because you only like it because you have this disease that is making you like it and so on. And it quickly devolves into something where there really isn't, I think, a good grounding for what to say. I mean, one can say, as one is saying, sort of with AI and other things, there's sort of the human condition, the central human condition, so to speak. And that's a thing we think is a good thing. But there are peripheral human conditions, which might also be to somebody else thought of as a good thing. So I think it's really hard to say, when is fixing something, okay, another thing to comment is sometimes people will say, sometimes in medical settings and so on, you should do this and that and the other because it will make you more typical, more kind of medically typical. Well, maybe you just don't want that. I mean, you say, well, okay, I didn't grow as tall as I might have grown. You're below the, a certain percentile of height. So you should have human growth hormone to grow taller. Well, maybe you actually are very happy being a bit shorter than other people or whatever. It's very hard. There's a certain tendency to say, the thing that's the most obvious thing to do in sort of the medical setup is to say, well, everybody should be typical. Everybody should be standard. It's not clear that that's, from any point of view, that that's really the right thing. And, you could say, well, it's let's say you're quite short. Well, yeah, the world may not be perfectly built for you. It may be that it's hard to see over the steering wheel in a car if you're not tall enough. Maybe you can fix that easily. But it's kind of like the world got built for the average, and then what do you do with the non-average? That's something that comes up in education all the time. Something I've noticed in my life. I happen to be left-handed, and that's 10% of the population of the world. And there are many insidious things that are very non-left-hander friendly. For example, one of my sort of favorites or something is the Command C, Command V kind of copy paste, Control C, Control V, whatever kind of computer you use, the copy paste mechanism, which if you use your mouse with your left hand, that means you're trying to move from the mouse to the copy paste with the same hand. if you were using a mouse with your right hand, those keys are conveniently on an American keyboard or something. Those keys are conveniently things you use with your left hand. It's sort of an insidious way in which kind of left-handedness is discriminated against in a sense. It's okay. You can there's all kinds of ways to get around that problem, but it's sort of interesting that the world is built for sort of the average of the average, and that's I suppose I don't think it's an adequate ethical argument for saying rewrite the genome to make every left-hander not be a left-hander because the world is not as conveniently built for left-handed people. That would be a strange conclusion, I would say. But yeah, no, it's a good question. When at what point, what is the let's say you decided, well, let's fix genomes. Let's make all the humans be typical. Let's make all the humans be the standard human. That will be a strange world, a very brave new world kind of world. It would be that would be, I think that would be pretty bad for the species to say, let's just make a production line of all the humans being the same. Because after all, if they're not typical, we might think that's wrong in some way. Well, clearly for society as a whole, having all humans be the same depends what you want out of society. If you want society to sort of run smoothly in some way, maybe that's a good outcome. But if you think that it's important for society to have any sense of progress, maybe you don't think that, then that's probably not something well achieved by having all the humans be the same. Anyway, interesting question. So Q is asking, if you had to engineer a superpower into the human genome, what would it be? Oh, I have long thought that people would eventually put jellyfish genes into the human genome so that one would have glow-in-the-dark people. I don't think that's a serious suggestion or a very useful suggestion. I recently had ordered a plant that was supposed to be a glow-in-the-dark plant, but it was very unsuccessful. One of my assistants actually got it, and she said you had to be in a very, very dark room, and before she'd get the plant to me, it had already died. So not yet a thing to have sort of your typical critter have jellyfish genes added to it to make it glow in the dark. Maybe humans could do that too. But in terms of what could we expect to modify? I don't know, we could expect to have a new photoreceptor, for example. We could expect to have, not just 3 color photoreceptors, but another one, maybe a little bit further into the infrared or something like this. I don't know how useful that would be. I'm not sure. There's often a trade-off with these things between external technology and internal biology, because, if we have augmented reality glasses that can see in the infrared and can give us an image that has that data, why do we need a built-in kind of infrared sensor in our eyes? I don't know what kinds of things one might do along those lines. I mean, it's always things that make one live longer and healthier. Those are always good things. Exactly what's involved in doing that. It's if we knew this is how we tweak the genome to live long and prosper type thing, that would be one thing. But I don't think that's going to be a very complicated issue. That's not going to be a thing where it's just like, oh, there's this bug, and if you fix the bug, everything works better. It is quite possibly the case that biology has given us a timer for how long we'll live, and that there might be ways to sort of disrupt that timer. But probably as a result of there having been that timer, a zillion things have been built around that timer that you then have to sort of reverse out. Like, for example, the idea of sleep. Who knows, maybe sleep is just clearing out gunk that develops in the brain. But around that one function is wrapped a huge number of other functions that are sort of put on top of the function of sleep. And one would suspect that if there was sort of a good reason to have organisms not live a really long time, like they just make there to be too many organisms, they make there be, too old and crotchety and sort of not make changes and things when they should, and those kinds of things, that if biology had that objective for having sort of a timer that led to a particular lifetime, then probably after that timer got put in, a zillion other things were sort of layered on top of that, of like, well, you can do this kind of thing without generating tumors because the pressure is only going to live that long, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it may be pretty difficult to reverse those things out. I think that yeah, I was recently studying sort of the computational foundations of medicine, trying to understand to what extent it's possible to, if one has sort of an idealized computational organism, to what extent one can, if it is sort of perturbed by something that makes it in effect get a disease and do something different than it was going to do before, what does it take to kind of get the thing back on track? And that is a fundamentally difficult problem. It's for very fundamental computational reasons, it's very hard to get the thing back on track. You might be able to get it to satisfy some particular attribute, like living a long time, but it won't live the same life that it would have led if it had been never perturbed in the first place. It might live a life that would make it perfectly happy, but it won't be the same as what it would be if it hadn't had that perturbation. Let's see. I mean, I'm trying to think what other attributes, it's a question of, well, what is, what's adaptively useful in the world as the world is today? I mean, there are things like, I don't know, like, if your hair falls out, well, it's kind of a nuisance, you have to wear a hat, you have to use technology to not get some sunburnt on the top of your head or whatever. But I always thought it would be a good thing that you could, if you were going to read out like EEG, read out brain signals directly from the brain. If you don't have a bunch of hair, then you get to stick those electrodes on without having a bunch of gooey stuff in your hair. I'm not sure that's actually played out. I haven't really made use of that basically ever. So it's sort of a bad thing in a sense. You lose the extra sun protection, so to speak, and you lose the ability to style your hair in all kinds of elaborate and communicative ways or something. But I don't know what things you might say. Well, if you could add capabilities, let's say, for example, you could add something to the genome that would make you sleep less. Not clear that's a good thing. It's not clear what consequence that would have. I mean, maybe if you sleep less, if you feel you need to sleep less, well, and you therefore sleep less, well, maybe a bunch of subsystems in your body progressively degrade much faster because you're not sleeping as much. And maybe, is it really going to be the case that maybe your memories don't get consolidated in as good a way as if you slept for longer and so on? You might think, I'm going to be much more efficient. I only sleep 4 hours a night. I've got 20 hours to do the things I want to do. But maybe that wouldn't actually work out that way. I mean, I think it's very difficult with there are lots of sort of unintended consequences in biology. And, you can get the one attribute, which is sort of live long enough to reproduce, we manage to get. What other attributes, we get for making what tweaks in the genome, it's hard to predict. Let's see. SA asks, will there ever be a hardware component to Wolfram projects? Well, I mean, we certainly have technology that, for example, will make the code for downloading to a microcontroller or something like that. People definitely use our tech to make quite directly hardware kinds of things. In terms of will we sell hardware beyond books and T-shirts and things? Well, that's an interesting question. We've had a number of projects at different times where we've thought about doing hardware kinds of things. Hardware always has the annoying feature that, if you're making little computers or something, you have to decide, I'm going to make 100,000 of these, or I'm going to make 10,000 of these or something. And if you get that wrong, you kind of get stuck with a warehouse full of those things. Or you have a lot of people unhappy because they can't get the things. So, the inventory aspects of hardware are difficult and expensive and require you're taking big financial risks often in those cases. But that's a very pragmatic thing. Actually, we did consider back, when was it? 15 years, a little bit more than that ago, we considered making a hardware calculator device. But this is sort of a doomed product in some ways. because, people have computers, people have smartphones. You can do pure, it's a software beats hardware type story. The hardware already exists, it's sort of universal. You can put on top of it a thing that does calculator-like things. I have to say, I was testing this at one of our high school summer programs years ago now, and I asked people about, should we make a calculator that runs Wolfram language inside, and so on and so on and so on. They were like, yes. I asked a group of college students, the same set of summer programs, and they're like, what do you mean? You have to be crazy. Why would anybody want a calculator? We've got computers, we've got phones. We don't need a separate, yet another thing to carry around. And it turned out that the real thing for the high school students was that, in the stack of the way the world works, sort of all these standardized tests sort of say, well, you can bring a calculator, but you can't bring a computer. And I always thought that was a pretty crazy thing, because you should be doing these tests on a computer. You should simply provide on the computer whatever calculator-like thing you want people to have. I mean, otherwise it's like, oh, you've got to buy a $150 calculator to take this test, which is really kind of an unreasonable barrier. To me, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make technological sense. It doesn't make kind of societal sense. It just really doesn't make sense. But for various, reasons of the dynamics of marketplaces and monopolies and all these kinds of things, I think that's a thing that still hasn't really been unhooked. And so it's still the case. I mean, I'm sure, I know Wolfram Alpha kind of made a big dent in that market of people saying, well, I want, this calculator that I can carry around, but I really mostly want it because that's what I get to use in my standardized test, which is a really weird sort of economic and technological constraint. I think that, so we considered making kind of a hardware calculator thing, but then I realized it's just a stupid product. We're not going to do it. So, it's a question of when is special purpose hardware worthwhile? And usually the experience has been that it's not, because there's so much economic force behind general purpose hardware, because there's so many different applications that pay for it, that a special purpose piece of hardware sort of never wins in the end. Well, I've said that for years, and there have been lots of cases where that's true, different kinds of coprocessors that are sort of the things about, floating point coprocessors and this kind of coprocessor, that kind of coprocessor, that kind of, analog digital mixed computing coprocessor, all these kinds of things. It's like coprocessors are never going to work. Well, so I thought. Then along come GPUs. And to my great surprise, GPUs are their own separate thing, independent of ordinary processors. I mean, there's some mergering of these things, and there are some cases where they're in the same chip and so on. But fundamentally, GPUs are a different thing. I think the reason is that the model of programming on CPUs is this fundamentally sequential model of programming. The model of programming on GPUs is fundamentally the sort of array type programming, and somehow in a more sort of parallel kind of programming. And somehow those programming models haven't really merged. I mean, you're still dealing with sort of exotic special languages to actually directly program a GPU. And, eventually, presumably that will get solved, and it will be more like the generic thing where you can use the same language on all the different GPU-like things, just like you can use the same language on different CPUs and so on. But that hasn't happened yet. It's still, there's a particular, it's an NVIDIA GPU, or it's an AMD GPU, or it's, an Apple GPU, or whatever else, and they're all sort of set up differently. And I think that there's some attempts to make kind of common frameworks, and there are companies that are now trying to make common frameworks that sort of live above the level of the GPU hardware. But again, it was sort of a surprise to me that GPUs survived and didn't just sort of fall back down into being CPU-like things with libraries and languages that support them. I think it's because the programming model is a bit different, and it isn't really supported by the typical languages in the usual form. So that's a but in terms of sort of motivation for us to build special purpose hardware, I just haven't seen it. I mean, I just haven't seen a case where we want to do that. I mean, there are other things that one can imagine, like, oh, would it be cool to have a keyboard that had sort of special characters on it but it really doesn't matter much. I mean, So you type a combination of 3 keys. You know where the keys are typed. We've only got 10 fingers. It works well. The alternative would be a big sort of mega organ keyboard or something where it would work great if we had 30 fingers, but we don't. We're stuck with the pure human, situation of having 10 fingers. You'd asked about sort of superpowers, and I don't know. I suppose one you might imagine, but I think it's a pretty silly one. Is hey, how about some extra fingers? But that's just a detail of interacting with current technology, and one could well imagine that you add a bunch more fingers. I mean, it's kind of like, does a millipede get to dance in a really elaborate way with its hundreds of legs? Well, no, it doesn't. It typically just has 2 modes of locomotion that correspond to kind of like the gallop and the walk type thing, of in phase and out of phase legs. Its brain, okay, it has a fairly small brain, but can't independently control a complicated dance of all those legs. And so one might very well think that even if we had sort of the hardware to have, the 20 fingers hardware, that it wouldn't really help much unless you sort of upgrade the brain as well, and so on. Let's see. I need to go to my day job here, but Christian asks, question I have is, which molecules can be made simply that have real impact? The thought is maybe heavy metal chelators. Yeah, I mean, one of the ways, if you get heavy metal in your body isn't used to that, and it doesn't really have a way to dispose of it, and it tends to accumulate. Something like lead, for example, tends to accumulate through your life, causing more and more trouble. And sort of a way to deal with that is to have molecules that form little cages, and the cage fits a lead atom inside it, and then can sort of chemically can pull that lead atom out of your body. And that's I don't know the state of the art in making chelation cages, and whether sort of it's and exactly how you build one that works, exactly pulls out europium or something. I don't know, and that's an interesting thought. I mean, the thing that has been sort of the big effort with molecular construction is always drugs and things that have biological effect, biomedical effect, where it's like, can we make a molecule that has this shape that fits in this binding pocket, and so on, that that does the right thing because it has the right shape. And in modern times, the latest big enthusiasm the last couple of years has been, let's use the sort of machine learning based folding technology we have for proteins, and let's be able to go from just sort of the description, I want a chelator for europium or something, to, oh, here's this cage made of proteins that will be exactly the right shape, size, and so on to take that kind of ion. There's been a bunch of enthusiasm for that recently, and a bunch of companies, I know a whole bunch of them, that have sort of grown up around that idea. I think sort of the jury is still out on how that will work. Looks promising, but it's looked promising before to design molecules. And as I say, in biology, there's always a footnote to a footnote to a footnote. And it's like you design the most fantastic molecule, but then it turns out that it's toxic because it does some crazy thing in the kidneys or something. That's and that's kind of a thing that comes out of nowhere. And you can say, well, I'm going to do toxicology studies, but then it turns out that the molecule has some other weird feature, interacts in some bizarre way with I don't know, magnetic fields in an MRI machine or something. Who knows? I mean, some weird thing that you never predicted, never saw coming. So I think it's but that's, I mean, the make a molecule that does something. Sort of the favorite thing is always, the typical design of a drug. The first step is to find a target, find a thing which on a molecule in some protein or something, some site where if you could ram something into that site to prevent it from being used, to prevent anything else from binding to it, if you could ram something into it to activate something, then you would have all kinds of good effects to find a target like that. And then there's the question of, can you actually find a molecule? Can you find a drug that will hit that target? And that's kind of, those are sort of two levels or two steps typically in the development of drugs. And I think, a good question is, well, what are the targets? What are the interesting targets? And I think a bunch of the targets have to do with diseases and so on, have to do with, oh, we now understand enough about that disease to know what that target is. I would say that probably one of the good sort of meta targets is things in the immune system, because the immune system has already been built to sort of go everywhere in the body. And if you can kind of tweak the immune system in just the right way, then you can potentially expect to deliver things in an effective way, because the immune system was sort of already built to do sort of global delivery around the body. So a few thoughts there. It's a good question though. I mean, maybe there are cases in of things. Well, I mean, even the optical switch that I was mentioning, maybe that will just be a thing made of some programmable molecule or something. We just don't know what it is yet, and that would be a thing to think about. Actually, there's a reasonable thing to think about that at a molecular scale. I'm not sure one's really thought about that. I mean, people have thought about optical switches made of materials, but materials that are sort of big crystals with huge numbers of molecules in them. But to think about it at the level of sort of a metamaterial where you're actually individually arranging molecules and things and thinking about what those molecules are like, that's an interesting challenge. Okay, so somebody on this live stream, go figure that out, and you'll have a big effect on the future of technology. Okay, I should wrap up. And okay, I'm seeing a suggestion here from Bay. Is what you want extra fingers on your hands, or do you want things on your head to hold on your hat, hold on to your hat, so to speak, for that kind of development? Yes, I mean, the problem is, again, you can imagine things like that, but the world has not been built for that. If we had, I don't know, let's say we have an extra pair of eyes somewhere. Well, we got a whole bunch of other issues of we've constructed things based on the fact that, we've constructed, I don't know, movies, let's say, where a movie is something that you look at on a screen in front of you. If you also have to have, the movie being realistic for your back eyes as well as your front eyes, it's a whole different story. There tend to be these stacks that get built based on the way that we are that are kind of awkward to avoid. But I think it's a good place to end here, that thinking about the future of technology and bio-inspired technology, the get fingers on your head to hang on to your hat. All right. Well, with that, I should depart, go back to my day job. But thank you all for lots of interesting questions and comments, and I look forward to chatting with you another time. Bye for now.